Hi, this is Michael Buffer, and let's get ready for EJ Boxing Live.
How you doing, fight fans? EJ Boxing Live here. So we're continuing our list, yeah? Boxing's legit badasses, and number 2 coming in is the old master, Joe Gans. And yeah, man, this is quite extensive research. I found information I got from Colleen Elcott and Mark Scott. The two of them are basically the narrators on this here video. And yeah, man, I hope you guys enjoy it. And yeah, man, give your thumbs up, get your popcorn ready, sit down and enjoy.
Joe Gans blazed the trail for the tremendous successes achieved by African American athletes in the 20th and 21st centuries. Gans was born in Baltimore, where he worked shucking oysters from an early age. He got his start in boxing by participating in the brutal and racist battle royals that were, during the Jim Crow era, an all too common form of entertainment at whites-only clubs. Up to a dozen young black boys or men were put in a ring, often blindfolded, and made to beat each other senseless until only one was left standing.
Where did he come from? Because his background was a real mystery. Some sources said that Gans was adopted, and they always referred to his foster mother. So we looked through the records to find out who that woman was, and her name was Maria Gant, Maria J. Gant. We know now that that's Maria Jackson Gant. But records would indicate that she had as many as 8 children, some of whom were adopted or fostered. So we don't really know if Joe Gans was one of those. But his picture, his eyes, he was always referred to in the media as having sad eyes. But we looked at him, and Mark and I wondered, you know, what is his nationality? Where did he come from? And I thought that he looked quite British, that his features were British. And many in my family thought that he looked like members of my boxing family. But he also has a look that maybe he came from the West Indies. So with research, we discovered that Maria Gant did in fact come from South America, that her family had immigrated to Baltimore in 1845 from British Guyana. And that colony, that British colony, had an interesting history. In 1807, it was outlawed. No country could import slaves from Africa after about 1807. And so that created a trafficking of slaves throughout the various countries internally. Baltimore became a big hub for transporting slaves. They had slave pens in that period of time between 1807 and the Civil War. And the slaves would be bought and sold and relocated to what they called the New Orleans market. So boats were always leaving Baltimore to go directly into the New Orleans market. In South America, in the British colony of Guyana, now known as Guyana, after they couldn't import slaves from Africa, they took slaves from the West Indies. And then in 1823, there was a tremendous uprising, a slave revolt in British Guyana that called attention to the problem of slavery. And the British Parliament then outlawed slavery. So they had done that in the late 1830s. And the transitional period between slavery and freedom was indenture. So they indentured their servants for 4 years. And it's at that time, in 1838, in those 4 years, that Joe Gant's mother, Maria Gant, then immigrated with her family to Baltimore. So Joe Gans really grew up with someone who probably spoke very proper British English, and he was always known to be articulate, quite modest, but he probably got that language pattern or air from his mother and her family's very proper British English. And also, he grew up as everyone did. He was born in 1874. So at that time period, he grew up as the first generation of free blacks in America. But he had already that experience of that freedom and that ability to take on and through determination perceive opportunities and then go out and get them and be very successful. And so I attribute that largely to his mother and her background.
In the early 1890s, Gans began to develop a sense of timing, distance, and ring generalship that would eventually earn him recognition as the Old Master of boxing. From 1894 to 1899, Gans fought over 60 bouts in Baltimore alone, along with his fights in other cities. By the year 1900, he was widely considered the best boxer in the world, though he was yet to receive his first opportunity to win a world championship. Already a certain mysticism had developed around the man they referred to as the Baltimore Negro. Although he was only 26, in the boxing world they were already calling him the Old Master. But the year 1900 would nearly bring his career to a premature end. Gans's first shot at the title would come in 1900. Gans and Frank Erne fought in February of 1900. Gans was winning the fight when in the 12th round a headbutt caused a large gash over his eye.
Well, you have probably the best, one of the best punchers in history, and he's not really defending himself. He's not punching. We know that he could keep anybody at bay with a left jab. He's not doing that, and he goes down 6 times in the second round. He goes down in the first round. The other thing, Joe Seiler, the referee, said that the punches, it looks like Gans is landing punches. So when you look at that today, it looks like he's landing punches. And he clearly has a bloody mouth. In the second round of this fight, if you're looking at it, he's spitting blood on the floor. I find that interesting because he's not spitting it in the face of McGovern. But regardless, he's been hit in the mouth. So to the casual observer, it looks like Gans is really defeated. Well, that was 1900 was the year for the fixed fights. The Chicago Tribune said that everyone was involved in, quote, shady dealings. And certainly that was a fixed fight. So if you want to talk about that fight in particular, the Gans-McGovern fight, that was December 13th, Friday the 13th, one of the last major fights of the year in Chicago. And Tatters All Hippodrome, and some reports said it was a huge fight. It was the end of the year and it was a big fight. Well, and we'll talk about, why was it such a big fight? Well, there are many reasons it was a big fight. But for one thing, Terry McGovern was coming in as the featherweight champion, and he really got the top billing. Joe Gans wasn't a title holder at that time. This is 1900. And I think some of the questions you need to ask about that fight, of course, I believe that it was a fake fight. There are still people today that believe it wasn't faked at all. But I think you have to look at the whole fight and look at what was happening before and after that fight. Essentially, here were the conditions of the fight. And that goes also to the fixed fights of 1900s. Now remember, there are no boxing commissions. There's no one out there to set the stage. That year certainly prepared all the various states for laws and things to come down the pike. But this was the reason that year was known for the fake fights. And almost everybody was involved in some kind of conditions. Well, why are there conditions? Okay, the condition for the McGovern-Gans fight was that if McGovern was still standing in 6 rounds, he would be declared the winner. Now, why that? I mean, is that the advantage that he gets from being 10 pounds lighter, 2 inches shorter? All of these various things. It's all about the betting odds. And when you really look at the technicalities of this fight, I think you have to consider everything that was happening around it. Well, why is Terry McGovern fighting? Why is Terry McGovern at 124 pounds fighting a man that is 10 pounds heavier than himself. You have to think Terry McGovern was a great fighter. I don't think people today give him enough credit for that. Terry had only lost one. He's coming in undefeated essentially. He'd only lost one fight by foul, and he is. He didn't get the name Terrible Terry for being, a wimp, and so he comes in with quite a pedigree there. But he had given up in 1900. He gave up the bantamweight title. He abandoned that, and then decided that since he was going to fight he had the featherweight title, and my guess is that he probably had wanted to fight Frank Erne, who was the lightweight titleist. Now, Frank is an interesting set of circumstances that happened in 1900. Frank Erne and Joe Gans fought in March, and that fight, there are many references to that being a faked fight as well. Joe Gans quit in the 12th round from a terrible headbutt. I talk about that extensively. Mark and I talk about that in the book. But think about it, if Mark had won that fight, it would have a different set of history today. If Joe Gans had won that, and there was a fight set up, then it's possible that Terry McGovern could have won 3 championships in 1 year, which would have been a stellar fact. Nobody'd ever achieved that. So,
hey, Colleen, quick question. I had a quick question for you. Didn't a lot of the kind of cloud that the fight was fixed have a lot to do with the wagers that were made just before the fight? The
betting odds shifted, and that's why we believe that something, and they did at the time too, was going on. Obviously, Gans was favored to win. I mean, there is no way that Terry could, with the history of all that had happened, that Terry could remain standing after 6 rounds.
Gans is in that fight, and so he gets hit. He gets headbutted. He gets hit. Again, you don't let up. I mean, first of all, there are no doctors in the ring that are going to stop anything.
Yeah.
You have to remember that. There are no doctors. Mm-hmm. They're not going to stop a fight until that fighter is down, out, over with, down. And you know what? At that time, there wasn't a 3-down rule. There wasn't a neutral corner. When that knee came up, you were fair game, and your opponent was standing there over you, ready to knock you down again.
Yeah.
Because you had to stay down to be down. So, yes, his eye was ripped open, and you can see the horrible gash in later pictures of the scar from that fight. I mean, normally he had a relatively unmarked face for having gone through, as many fights as he did, to over 200 fights. But his eye was, I believe, knocked literally. I think it was torn open so that it looked like it was out of his socket. And the referee demanded that he continue fighting.
Mm-hmm. Who was the guy he was fighting at the time?
That was Frank Erne.
Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah. People said Frank Erne wasn't a great fighter. Well, let me tell you, you don't win from Levine if you're not a great fighter. So, I think the problem is to be able to determine whether or not you're a great fighter. You have to look at all of the fights and their setups and who won. But also, I think you have to look at the footage.
I agree.
And you don't have a lot of footage from those early fights, so it's difficult to say who was really great and who wasn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, still, on the whole, granted, there were many fighters that fought hundreds of fights, and many white fighters. But if you look at the black fighters and their records, they were fighting twice, 3 times, more fights. They were fighting once a week, certainly once a month. They weren't fighting once a year like some of the fighters that came later on.
Yeah.
But I've gotten some criticism about the fact that Joe Gans wore 5-ounce gloves into his fight with Nelson. because people thought they were 6-ounce gloves. So I mean, let me tell you, people are fanatic about their boxing history.
Yeah.
But the reason that Joe Gans wore 5-ounce gloves, because the lightweights, considered really almost into what we would call the middleweights today, they all wore 5-ounce gloves. The heavies wore 6-ounce gloves. So that is the distinction in the period of time that I'm talking about, 1890s to 1910. The lighter weights wore 5-ounce gloves, and the heavies wore 6-ounce gloves. So that's the distinction there in gloves. And of course, the gloves were made differently. They were primarily horsehair stuffed at that time. You will find some gloves that are stuffed with wood chips as well, wood shavings. And those gloves go into the 30s. You'll still find gloves in the 30s with wood shavings in them.
Well,
Now, Joe Gans was a different situation. He had quite a bit of money. I think it's estimated that he made up to 100, and by these accounts, you don't know if the newspapers are exaggerating, but in one year he was said to have made about $180,000. Wow. Well, that doesn't include his expense during that year. But if you look at Joe Gans after the 1906 fight, the longest fight, by the way, that was Mark and my art title, The Longest Fight, not someone else who came along to write the book. But anyway, when you look at those fights, he had tuberculosis and he was suffering, so he had to pay a great deal of money for treatments and things like that.
Tuberculosis was a very common disease at the time in the turn of the century. I don't know nothing about tuberculosis. Can you explain what it is? Because this for me, I don't understand. I don't know what it is, but it was a common thing at the time.
It was very common. It's caused by a bacteria, and remember, there's no penicillin. There's nothing to combat these terrible, tragic diseases. Tuberculosis can lie dormant in your system your entire life. Most all of the boxers, I will say virtually all of the boxers, probably had the germ in them at the time. Even my father did by the 1930s, and he later developed a case late in his life. So that's called latent tuberculosis. But it can become active under any strenuous situation. And certainly Joe Gans was under quite a bit of stress. The great Peter Jackson died of tuberculosis. They all carried the germs.
What does it do to you, tuberculosis, to your body?
Tuberculosis, the most common form, would attack your lungs, and it would cause your the alveoles in your lungs to actually bleed. So you would be coughing up blood, and the way that you would actually perish, and the way that Joe Gans actually perished, was from your lungs filling up with blood, and you would suffocate. You would slowly suffocate. It would be like having an asthma attack continually without any means of help.
Wow.
So it was a very, very, very contagious, very, very tragic. And if you think of all the spit buckets in those days and the water bottles, and the dirty gems, but really the sputum. I mean, you're coughing and choking in front of everybody, and you're hugging and kissing everybody after the match, and your sweat, everything contains that germ.
Wow, thanks for that. I've actually pictured that now, because I actually remember loads of fighters. See, at the turn of the century, a lot of them contracted that, and
everybody. I mean, it was the number one illness. While they would say pneumonia was the number one illness of the time, there was very little distinction through the statistics of whether or not it was tuberculosis or pneumonia.
Wow.
Now, tuberculosis in the Gans family, I've been doing a lot of research for the current Gans family and their history. That in their family, their predecessor too died of tuberculosis. They all had it, I think. But it was in the more congested cities, and certainly in the more humid areas. That's why people would try to go out west and get into the dry climates, where, literally your sputum would dry before it could reach somebody else, and hopefully it would dry out your lungs. And a very primitive, I don't even want to go into the primitive. Well, maybe I will, but the treatments for that, Joe Gans suffered. Joe Gans was terribly afraid of needles. And think about it, I was afraid. I was an asthmatic, and this is so bizarre, EJ. I grew up in South Texas, and when the doctor said you have to send her west and they said, well, my parents hadn't been anywhere else. They said, where do we take her? And the doctor said from Laredo, Texas, in Mexico, said take her to Prescott, Arizona. It's a very high, dry place. Guess where Joe Gans had to go in the last months of his life? He went to Prescott, Arizona to recuperate. He and I were within 2 blocks. Different. Granted, it was, different, 50 years time difference, maybe 80 years time difference, but, they're in the same place. And so people did try to go out west, but the treatment for that was terrible. Joe Gans was afraid of needles because they didn't have disposable needles. You had to polish the needles to try to get them sharp enough to get into the next person. And they would plunge those needles into his lungs and try to draw off blood from it. The other thing would be they would force fluids down your lungs to try to dilute with what they called germicides. And those germicides were supposed to kill. And then you would, if you were lucky, you wouldn't suffocate from the germicidal treatment that they were flooding your lungs with.
Some of it, you mentioned about your father being born on the 13th, is that, and you can see some of the treatment. It's like witchcraft, and I don't know, it's just barbaric. Some of the methods they use to try and cure you, and how superstitious they are.
Yes, they were, and the boxers themselves were. That's another hour of discussion.
Hey, I'm good. Go ahead, Curly, as much as you can. I don't know.
I mean, the superstitions of the boxers. I mean, that was amazing too. I love that. I think every boxer to this day has a superstition. They always wear their favorite token or something, their color, or something into the ring. But in those days, literally, if you had something that would cause you to survive, that was amazing, because you couldn't survive. Now think about poor Joe Gans fighting under those circumstances with tuberculosis, and Peter Jackson fighting with active tuberculosis.
They used to fight with the tuberculosis. I thought they contracted it after they finished fighting. They were fighting with tuberculosis.
Yes, Joe Gans fought his last fight certainly with Nelson with active TB.
Whoa, man! Wow, they've got to be brave. Go ahead.
Let me tell you, they're not brave. They are tough.
Yeah, man.
42 rounds with active TB.
So that's crazy, you wouldn't even think of it these days. A lot of fighters, they wouldn't go through that. They wouldn't, because how are you breathing?
Exactly. And to be short of breath, and to be coughing, and to be coughing up blood, no less. To me, can you see why these men are my heroes?
Yeah. I mean, I'm there with you, and everyone else listening. Listen, I'm telling you, these are the things that the fight fans need to hear. You can't listen. You can't live on the current fights. You need to know where these guys came from. They need to know the roots of the fight game.
Yeah, and these were the guys. They were Joe Gans. The early scientific fighters. They perfected. Dal Hawkins actually perfected another early fighter, the left hook. But these guys perfected these things. Joe Gans, what I love about his techniques that he perfected and that we still do today, you can hear trainers try to prepare these guys for circling their fighter around, so you get them, circle to the right to offset, a particular jab. That circling motion was what Joe Gans perfected.
Yes.
When Jack Johnson says that he looks like he's on skates up there, that's what he's talking about. That circling motion. He's very fluid. Today you just hear people yelling at him, move. Yeah. But he was actually circling to measure the angles. And what I love about the Joe Gans opponents, why they were so afraid of Joe Gans, what they worried about, not necessarily afraid of him, because I don't think anybody that stepped into the ring in those days was afraid of anything. Yeah. But what they worried about was that they would tell you specifically that Joe Gans had this uncanny knack of knowing what you were going to throw, and he could counter it before you knew you were going to throw it.
Yeah. I can.
And so, to me, that was like drawing out your fighter. So Joe Gans then perfected. To me, it's not superstition. He was drawing out the punch that he wanted and had measured to counter.
Yeah, wow, extraordinary. I mean, even when you see him fight, like you said, he fights like a modern day fighter as you see now. I mean,
Thank you. When I first started writing about him, nobody thought he. Do you know? People didn't even think he threw combination punches.
Yeah,
when I first, I can't believe that.
Yeah, when I saw the footage, I was like, what's this? How can he fight like that? I knew most of the people fought like John L. Sullivan or Jack Johnson, where they clinch in, they grab you, they maul you, hold
rushing.
You down, throwing overhand shots. Joe Gans is pumping at the jab, angles, moving around.
Exactly.
And the fighters of the day, you can see easily, it was easy to counter them type of guys. They never fought that way. And as you said, with Joe Louis, exactly, I never really, I didn't know the connection there,
Absolutely. Jack Blackburn tried to teach him to fight just exactly like Joe Gans.
And you could see it because Joe Louis, he used the jab, and everything came off the jab with Joe Louis.
Exactly.
Everything came off the jab with him was perfect,
Exactly. Go pull up Joe Gans and Kid Herman. You'll see that was one of the most popular fights of its time, and that was 1907. It was shown everywhere for 2 years, and they were making money in the theaters with that fight. This was a perfect fight. Joe Gans let him go 8 rounds, and then he knocked him out with the most killer knockout you have ever seen, and it was always mentioned to be the best knockout of its time.
Joe Gans, between the time he lost to Frank Ern in 1900 and the time he fought him again in 1902, fought 34 fights, very difficult fights as well. When Gans fought Frank Ern the second time in 1902, they had to move the fight to Fort Erie, Canada, and there was various reasons why they did that. In New York, there were concerns about fixed fights and so forth, and the year before, President McKinley had been shot, so there was concerns about having a boxing match in New York, and they decided to have the fight in Fort Erie, Canada. And before the fight, Gans had wanted to study Frank Ern, and of course he fought him before in 1900, and even though Gans was winning the fight before he got butted, he was having trouble with Frank Ern's. He had a strange move. He had a very good left jab, and he would move his head in a certain way, and so when Gans was training for the fight, he told his sparring partner to imitate or to throw his left jab like Frank Ern would do, and the sparring partner was instructed to throw the jab and move his head in a way like Frank Ern would do. And Gans he practiced and timed it, and so after a while he had it figured out just perfectly where Ern would throw his jab and move his head. And so when they fought in the very first round, when the first time Ern did that, he moved his head, and there was Gans' right hand just smack on his chin, knocked him out. He was knocked cold. When he woke up, Frank Ern was shocked. He didn't know what had happened to him. And Gans was the champion.
By the way, in 2005, 2006, 2007, there was no one on the street that even knew who Joe Gans was. Yeah. I'm very proud that today almost everybody knows who Joe Gans was. Yeah. But there was no one there. When my husband and I drove to the graveyard, Mount Auburn Cemetery, to locate his grave, we pulled up. The thing was in chains. It was awful. Here was this very historic American cemetery with the greatest people, not just Joe Gans buried prominently in the front there, but great people of early history. We should have revered that graveyard, but here it was in shambles. It was chained. Well, there was a policeman parked right in front of what looked like the projects at the time, and So the policeman, I went up to him and I said to this policeman, I'm going to go over those chains and I just want to tell you what I'm doing. See, you never can say, is it okay for me to go over it? Because I was afraid he would tell me no. And I was determined to find Joe Gans' grave.
Yeah.
Well, so anyway, he looked at me like, well, you're crazy if you want to go, in that graveyard. But I said, I'm going to go over there. I just want to let you know, because I didn't want to be arrested, quite honestly, for trespassing. And so I said, and he said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, I am looking for the grave of the magnificent Joe Gans. And he looked at me and I said, have you ever heard of Joe Gans? And he said, no, he never had. So I proceeded to give him a quick boxing lesson, or a boxing history lesson. But isn't that a shame but I'm not putting him down. I'm just saying that was the sign of the times.
Yeah.
That you have a man who is literally there guarding that area every minute, of his shift. And within eye distance, here was a great man buried whose grave we ought to revere again for all time.
Yeah.
And that was very sad for me. But regardless, I hopped over and photographed the grave, and then found the two old boxers that were trying to keep that grave, and they are friends of mine to this day, and I cherish that memory. But it was very difficult in those days to find anything about Joe Gans, and of course you had to throw yourself in a library in the dungeons and look through old newspaper clippings. And today it's so wonderful because more and more things are coming online, and people have access to these early research tools, and I think that's wonderful. When I heard that Mike Tyson visited that grave, you know what? I was in love with Mike Tyson. If Mike Tyson wanted to visit the grave of Joe Gans, a fighter who I so admire, and then, you know what? Mike Tyson couldn't do anything bad in my book.
Yeah, man, it's quite deep, man. As you can see, Mike Tyson visit Joe Gans' grave, and yeah, man, pays your respects, and Clean Elcott gives Mike Tyson respects for that, and for Mike Tyson, a historian as well. And the old master deserves your respect out of Baltimore. And when you come down to researching in these old time fighters, yeah, you give a respect, man. But 100%, he's a legit badass. The old master, Joe Gans. And the master of he's the inventor of what you say modern day fighting now, of the jab, the things he had to go through, you know what I'm saying, wasn't fixed fights. They forced him into fixed fights. They were surprised that he was winning fights the way he did in the time and era he did it. He deserves to be a badass, and that's why he's on the list at number 2. All praise and respect to the old master Joe Gans. Anyway, man, fight fans, I'm EJ Boxing Live. Hope you enjoyed, and get ready for number 1 of the Boxing Legit Badasses. Catch you in a bit. Peace.
EJ Boxing Live here. EJ Boxing Live here.